The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the red velvet ropes. Among them stood Marcus Chen, a United States Marine on leave, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. His short-cropped black hair and alert brown eyes scanned the crowd with practiced awareness, a habit ingrained through 3 tours in Afghanistan. Marcus had come to London to visit his sister Sarah, who worked as a translator for the American embassy. This was supposed to be his vacation, a chance to decompress after months of combat operations in Helmand Province. But even in the peaceful setting of the palace grounds, his mind remained sharp, always assessing, always ready. The crowd murmured with anticipation as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Families with children pressed closer to the barriers, cameras ready to capture the famous red-coated sentries. Marcus found himself studying the royal guards with professional interest. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers putting on a show for tourists. Many were combat veterans themselves, elite troops from regiments that had fought alongside American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. Standing motionless at his post near the palace gates was Guardsman James Whitfield of the Coldstream Guards, 26 years old, 6 feet tall, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to see everything while appearing to focus on nothing. His red tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, his rifle held at the precise angle demanded by centuries of tradition. To the tourists, he was a living statue, part of the pageantry they had come to see. But Marcus recognized something in Whitfield's stance that the casual observers missed. This was a soldier who had seen action. The way he held his weapon, the subtle alertness beneath the ceremonial stillness, the micro-movements of his eyes as he tracked potential threats in the crowd. These were the marks of a combat veteran. Whitfield, for his part, had noticed the American almost immediately. Military bearing was difficult to hide, even in civilian clothes. The way the man carried himself, his positioning in the crowd to maintain good sightlines, the unconscious way his hand drifted toward where a sidearm would rest. All spoke of active-duty military experience. Recent experience. From the look of him, the ceremony began with the arrival of the new guard, their boots striking the pavement in perfect synchronization. The band played stirring military marches while officers barked commands in voices that carried across the square. Tourists pressed forward, eager to capture the spectacle on their phones and cameras. Marcus watched with professional appreciation as the guards executed their drill with mechanical precision. Every movement was calculated, practiced thousands of times until it became second nature. He understood the discipline required to achieve such perfection. In the Marines, attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Here, it preserved a tradition stretching back centuries. As the old guard prepared to march off, something caught Marcus's attention. A man in the crowd, roughly 30 yards to his left, was behaving strangely. While everyone else focused on the ceremony, this individual kept glancing around nervously, his hand repeatedly going to a large backpack at his feet. The man was sweating despite the cool morning air, and his eyes had the darting, unfocused quality Marcus had learned to associate with extreme stress or chemical enhancement. The suspicious individual appeared to be Middle Eastern, wearing a dark jacket that looked too heavy for the weather. His backpack was bulky, and he kept adjusting its position with unusual care. Most telling of all, he wasn't watching the ceremony that had drawn everyone else's attention. Instead, he was studying the crowd, the barriers, the positions of the police officers scattered throughout the area. Marcus felt his combat instincts engage. Years of training and experience had taught him to trust his intuition about threats, and every alarm bell in his mind was ringing. He began moving slowly through the crowd, using his size and military bearing to navigate between tourists without causing a disturbance. His goal was to get a better view of the suspicious individual and assess the situation more clearly. From his position at the palace gate, Guardsman Whitfield had also noticed the unusual behavior in the crowd. His training included threat assessment, and something about the nervous man with the backpack didn't fit the normal pattern of tourist behavior. But Whitfield was bound by strict protocol. As a ceremonial guard, he was not permitted to break position or speak unless directly addressed by an officer. His role was to maintain the dignity of the ceremony while remaining alert to genuine security threats. The situation created a unique problem. Both Marcus and Whitfield had identified a potential threat, but neither was in a position to act directly. Marcus was a foreign military member with no authority on British soil. Whitfield was a serving soldier who could not abandon his post without explicit orders from his commanding officer. As Marcus worked his way closer to the suspicious individual, he noticed more troubling details. The man's backpack appeared to have wires protruding from one corner, carefully hidden beneath a flap, but visible to someone looking from the right angle. The individual was now mumbling to himself in what sounded like Arabic, his agitation increasing as the ceremony reached its climax. The crowd around Marcus was completely oblivious to the developing situation. Children laughed and pointed at the guards, tourists snapped photos, and families chatted about their vacation plans. The contrast between their innocent enjoyment and the potential danger in their midst made Marcus's blood run cold. If his suspicions were correct, they were all in immediate peril. He tried to catch the attention of one of the police officers stationed around the perimeter, but they were focused on crowd control and couldn't see what he was seeing. The nearest officer was at least 50 feet away, separated by hundreds of tourists pressed tightly together. By the time Marcus could fight his way through the crowd and explain the situation, it might be too late. From his post, Whitfield watched the Americans' movements with growing understanding. The foreign soldier had identified the same threat and was trying to position himself to respond, but the crowd was too dense, and the suspect was becoming increasingly agitated. Whitfield could see the man's lips moving rapidly, his face flushed with sweat despite the cool air. The ceremony continued around them, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding in the crowd. The band played Rule Britannia as the guards completed their complex drill movements. Tourists applauded, and children waved small British flags. The pageantry that had drawn them all here was about to become the backdrop for potential tragedy. Marcus realized he was running out of time. The suspicious individual was now reaching into his backpack, his movements becoming more deliberate and purposeful. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon, and Marcus was still too far away to intervene effectively. The crowd was too thick, the distance too great. That's when he made eye contact with guardsman Whitfield. Across 40 yards of crowded courtyard, two professional soldiers looked at each other and shared an instant understanding. No words were spoken, no gestures made, but both men recognized they had identified the same threat and faced the same impossible situation. Marcus was too far away and had no legal authority. Whitfield was close enough but couldn't break protocol without risking court-martial. The moment stretched between them, filled with the weight of decision and the knowledge that innocent lives hung in the balance. Around them, the ceremony continued its ancient ritual, while a modern threat prepared to unfold. Two warriors from different nations, bound by codes of honor and duty that seemed to make action impossible, faced each other across a space filled with civilians who had no idea they were in danger. In that frozen instant, Marcus saw something change in Whitfield's eyes. A decision was being made, protocol weighed against human life. The Royal Guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Marcus knew that the British soldier was about to risk everything to protect the innocent people around them. The suspicious man's hand emerged from his backpack holding what appeared to be a detonator device. His mumbling had become an audible chant, and his eyes had taken on the glazed look of someone committed to violence. The moment of truth had arrived, and both Marcus and Whitfield knew that the next few seconds would determine whether the ceremony ended in celebration or catastrophe. Marcus began pushing through the crowd with renewed urgency, no longer caring about maintaining a low profile. But even as he moved, he knew he couldn't reach the threat in time. The distance was too great, the crowd too dense. Everything now depended on what the British guardsman would do next. Whitfield stood motionless at his post, bound by centuries of tradition and military law. But in his eyes, Marcus could see the war between duty to protocol and duty to humanity. It was a conflict every soldier understood. The moment when rules and reality collided, and a man had to choose who he really was. The crowd pressed closer to get better photos as the ceremony reached its climax. The band played with military precision while hundreds of innocent people unknowingly stood in the shadow of potential death. And in the space between an American Marine and a British guardsman, the fate of everyone present hung in the balance of a decision that would have to be made in the next heartbeat. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years afterward. But to the two soldiers involved, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Guardsman James Whitfield made his choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. With movements so subtle that most observers would miss them entirely, he began to communicate with Marcus Chen, using a combination of military hand signals and micro-expressions that only another professional soldier would recognize. Whitfield's right index finger, barely visible to anyone not watching specifically for it, tapped twice against his rifle. In military sign language, this meant enemy identified. His eyes then flicked toward the suspicious individual, confirming the target. Marcus, still pushing through the crowd but now with greater purpose, acknowledged the signal with an almost imperceptible nod. The terrorist, for both men now understood that's what they were dealing with, had pulled his hand from the backpack and was holding what appeared to be a cell phone modified with additional wiring. His chanting had become more urgent, and sweat poured down his face despite the cool London morning. Around him, tourists continued taking photos, completely unaware that death stood among them. Whitfield's training kicked in with mechanical precision. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Coldstream Guards, including 8 months in Helmand Province, where he had learned to identify improvised explosive devices and the behavioral patterns of suicide bombers. Everything about the man with the backpack matched the profile he had been trained to recognize. But Whitfield faced an impossible situation. Palace protocol strictly forbade guards from breaking position during ceremonies, except in cases of direct physical attack on the royal family or their immediate vicinity. The terrorist was in the crowd, not threatening the palace directly. If Whitfield moved from his post without explicit orders, he would face court-martial and the end of his military career. Yet if he remained motionless, innocent people would die. Marcus understood the British soldier's dilemma because he faced a similar one. As a foreign military member on vacation in London, he had no legal authority to act. If he tackled the suspect without clear evidence of immediate threat, he could be arrested for assault. Worse, if he was wrong about the threat, his actions could create an international incident that would damage relationships between American and British forces. The ceremony continued around them, a carefully choreographed dance of tradition and precision. The Queen's Guard Band played the British Grenadiers, while officers called out commands in voices trained to carry across battlefields. Hundreds of tourists pressed closer to the barriers, eager to capture the perfect photograph of the famous red-coated sentries. Through the crowd, Marcus caught glimpses of the terrorists' increasingly erratic behavior. The man was now rocking slightly back and forth, his lips moving in what appeared to be a final prayer. His thumb hovered over the modified cell phone's keypad, and Marcus could see additional wires running from the device into the backpack at his feet. The American Marines' combat experience told him they had minutes at most before the attack commenced. Suicide bombers typically went through a final mental preparation phase before detonating their devices. The rocking motion, the prayer-like mumbling, the way the man's eyes had taken on a distant, almost peaceful expression. These were all signs that the moment of action was approaching. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him regardless of the outcome. He began moving through the crowd more aggressively, using his size and strength to push past tourists who protested his rudeness. He had to reach the terrorist before the man could complete his deadly task, even if it meant sacrificing his own life in the process. From his post 40 yards away, Whitfield watched the American's progress with growing concern. The Marine was still too far away, and his movement through the crowd was beginning to attract attention. Several tourists had turned to complain about the rude man pushing past them, and one of the police officers had started moving in their general direction to investigate the disturbance. That's when Whitfield made a decision that went against every aspect of his training and tradition. With movements so precise they seemed part of the ceremony itself, he began to shift his position at the palace gate. To casual observers, it appeared that he was making a minor adjustment to his stance, the kind of subtle movement guards occasionally made during long periods of motionless duty. But Marcus recognized what was happening. The British guardsman was moving himself into a position where he could act if necessary, while maintaining the appearance of ceremonial duty. It was an incredibly risky decision that required perfect timing and absolute precision. One wrong move, one moment where his actions appeared obviously non-ceremonial, and both his career and the dignity of the ceremony would be destroyed. The terrorist's behavior was becoming more pronounced. His rocking motion had increased, and he had begun to weep while continuing his mumbled prayers. Several tourists near him had started to notice his strange behavior, but they interpreted it as religious devotion or perhaps emotional overwhelm at witnessing the famous ceremony. None of them recognized the signs of a man preparing to commit mass murder. Marcus was now 20 yards from his target, close enough to see the modified detonator clearly. The device was definitely homemade, with exposed wires and what appeared to be a dead man's switch mechanism. If the terrorist released pressure on the device, or if something happened to him suddenly, the bomb would still explode. This meant that simply tackling the man might not prevent the attack. The Marine's training kicked in as he assessed his options. A direct assault would likely trigger the device. Calling out a warning would cause panic and might still result in detonation. His best chance was to somehow disable the terrorist without triggering the bomb. But that required getting close enough to control both the man and the device simultaneously. Through the crowd, he caught Whitfield's eye again. The guardsman had positioned himself so that he could move quickly if needed, but he was still bound by protocol and the need to maintain the ceremony's dignity. Both men understood that they were facing a situation where traditional rules and procedures were inadequate to address the threat. The terrorist suddenly stopped rocking and stood perfectly still. His weeping ceased, and his face took on an expression of calm determination that Marcus recognized as the final phase before attack. The man's thumb moved closer to the detonator's trigger mechanism, and his other hand reached into his jacket pocket. In that moment, everything changed. A small child, perhaps 6 years old, broke free from his parents and ran toward the barriers separating the crowd from the ceremony area. The boy was laughing and pointing at the guards, clearly delighted by the spectacle. His movement brought him directly into the path between Marcus and the terrorist, creating a human shield that made any direct action impossible. The child's parents called out in alarm, and several police officers began moving toward the barrier to retrieve the wayward boy. Their movement created additional confusion in the crowd, with tourists shifting position to get better views, and parents pulling their own children closer to prevent similar escapes. Marcus found his path blocked by the surging crowd. People pressed against him from all sides as they tried to see what was happening with the escaped child. The terrorist, perhaps triggered by the sudden commotion, began reaching for something in his jacket while his thumb hovered over the detonator. From his position at the palace gate, Whitfield watched the scene unfold with growing desperation. The child was now directly in the line of fire, the crowd was in chaos, and the terrorist appeared to be entering his final sequence. Every instinct told him to abandon his post and intervene, but doing so would likely make the situation worse rather than better. That's when the unexpected happened. The child, still laughing with delight, ran not toward the ceremony area, as everyone assumed, but directly toward the terrorist. The boy had apparently mistaken the nervous, sweating man for someone important, perhaps thinking his emotional state was related to the excitement of the ceremony. The terrorist, startled by the child's sudden appearance, stepped backward and nearly dropped his detonator. For a moment, his attention was completely focused on the small boy reaching up to tug at his jacket. In that instant of distraction, Marcus saw his opportunity. But he also saw something else that changed everything. The terrorist wasn't reaching for another weapon in his jacket pocket. He was pulling out a photograph, a picture of what appeared to be his own family, a wife and 2 children, both about the same age as the boy now standing directly in front of him. The man's face contorted with anguish as he looked at the photograph, then at the child, then at the hundreds of families around him who had come to witness a celebration of British tradition. For the first time since Marcus had been watching him, the terrorist seemed to truly see the innocent people who would be killed if he carried out his planned attack. The moment stretched between them all. Marcus frozen in the crowd, Whitfield motionless at his post, the terrorist staring at a photograph of his family while a strange child smiled up at him trustingly. Around them, the ceremony continued with mechanical precision, while the greatest drama unfolded in absolute silence among the spectators. Marcus realized he was witnessing something he had never seen before in 3 tours of combat duty. A terrorist was having second thoughts. The man with the detonator was wavering, torn between his commitment to his cause and the reality of the innocent lives that would be lost. It was a moment of pure human drama playing out in the shadow of centuries-old tradition. The question now was whether this moment of doubt would save lives or simply delay the inevitable. Marcus remained ready to act if necessary, but he recognized that sometimes the most important battles were fought in the human heart rather than on physical battlefields. The terrorist was fighting a war with himself, and the outcome of that internal conflict would determine whether the ceremony ended in celebration or catastrophe. The child's innocent presence had created an impossible moment. 6-year-old Tommy Morrison stood directly in front of the would-be terrorist, completely unaware of the danger he faced. The boy was fascinated by the man's emotional state, interpreting the tears and heavy breathing as excitement about the ceremony rather than the internal struggle of someone preparing for mass murder. "Are you crying because the soldiers are so pretty?" Tommy asked in the clear, carrying voice that only children possess. His question, innocent and pure, cut through the terrorist's resolve like a blade through silk. The man, whose name was Khalil Hassan, a 34-year-old engineering student radicalized by online propaganda, stared down at the child with growing horror at what he had been about to do. Marcus watched the exchange with tactical awareness but growing fascination. In all his combat experience, he had never witnessed anything like this moment of pure human connection disrupting the machinery of violence. The terrorist's hand was trembling now, his thumb still hovering over the detonator but no longer with the steady purpose it had shown moments before. From his position at the palace gate, Guardsman Whitfield observed the scene with equal intensity. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for watching a terrorist have an emotional breakdown in the middle of a crowd of innocent tourists. The British soldier found himself in the strange position of hoping that human decency would accomplish what military intervention could not. Tommy's parents, meanwhile, had spotted their escaped son and were pushing through the crowd toward him. "Tommy! Get back here right now!" his mother called, her voice carrying the particular mix of panic and embarrassment that parents feel when their children misbehave in public. But her calls only seemed to encourage the boy to engage more deeply with his new friend. "Why do you have that phone?" Tommy asked, pointing at the modified device in Khalil's hand. "My mummy says I can't have a phone until I'm 10. "Are you 10? The question was so absurd, so completely removed from the gravity of the situation, that Khalil actually let out a strangled laugh. Here he was, prepared to commit an act of mass murder in service of what he believed was a holy cause. And a 6-year-old was asking him about age-appropriate technology usage. Marcus realized that the terrorist's emotional state was becoming increasingly unstable. The man was crying openly now, his entire body shaking as he looked at the photograph in one hand and the detonator in the other. This level of psychological distress could go either way. It might lead to abandoning the attack, or it might trigger a panic response that would result in accidental detonation. The Marine began moving again, but slowly and carefully. Any sudden movement might startle the already fragile terrorist into action. Marcus had to get close enough to control the situation without appearing threatening. It was a delicate balance that required all his training and experience to maintain. Around them, the ceremony reached its midpoint. The old guard was preparing to march off, while the new guard took their positions. The band struck up the Gary Owen, and the precision of the drill movements continued to captivate the crowd. Most tourists remained completely oblivious to the life-and-death drama unfolding just yards away. Khalil's internal struggle was becoming visible to anyone paying attention. He kept looking at the photograph of his family, then at little Tommy, then at the crowds of families around him. The propaganda videos that had radicalized him had spoken of enemy combatants and military targets, not children asking innocent questions about mobile phones. "I need to call my mummy," Tommy announced, reaching toward the device in Khalil's hand. "She's probably worried about me." The innocent gesture nearly caused disaster. As Tommy's small hand moved toward the detonator, Khalil jerked backward in panic, nearly triggering the device. Marcus saw what was happening and made a split-second decision that would either save lives or end them all. moving with the fluid grace that came from years of combat training. Marcus closed the distance between himself and the terrorist in 3 quick strides, but instead of tackling the man or going for his weapon, the Marine did something completely unexpected. He knelt down beside Tommy and spoke to the child in a calm, friendly voice. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus said, his tone conversational despite the tension of the moment. "I think this gentleman is having a hard day. Maybe we should give him some space to think, okay?" Tommy looked up at the large American with curious eyes. "Are you a soldier too?" he asked. "You stand like the pretty soldiers by the palace." "I am a soldier," Marcus confirmed, his eyes never leaving Khalil's face. "And sometimes soldiers need to help people who are scared or confused. This man seems like he might need some help." It was a brilliant tactical move. By positioning himself as a helper rather than a threat, Marcus had gotten close enough to act if necessary while also creating a human connection that might help stabilize the terrorist's emotional state. He was now within arm's reach of both the child and the detonator, able to protect one and control the other if the situation deteriorated. Khalil stared at the American soldier with a mixture of confusion and recognition. He could see the professional competence in Marcus's movements, the way he had positioned himself to control the situation without appearing aggressive. This was clearly a man who understood warfare, yet he was speaking gently to a child and offering help rather than delivering threats. "You know what I have," Khalil whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the ceremony. It wasn't a question but a statement of mutual understanding between 2 professional combatants. "I know what you're carrying," Marcus replied quietly. "But I also know you're having second thoughts. That little boy sees something good in you. Maybe you should listen to him." Marcus, from his position at the gate, Whitfield watched the extraordinary conversation with professional admiration. The American was handling the situation with exactly the right combination of strength and compassion. By acknowledging the terrorist's struggle rather than simply trying to stop him, Marcus had created an opening for resolution that pure force could never achieve. Tommy, oblivious to the subtext of the adult conversation, had decided that both men needed cheering up. "You should watch the soldiers," he announced, pointing toward the ceremony. "They make me happy when I'm sad. Mummy says they protect everyone, even people who are scared." The child's words hit Khalil like a physical blow. Here was everything wrong with his planned action, summed up in the innocent wisdom of a 6-year-old. These soldiers did protect people. The families around him weren't enemies but innocent civilians. The children weren't military targets but precious lives deserving of protection. Marcus saw the moment of decision approaching and prepared himself for any outcome. "You have family," he said softly, nodding toward the photograph still clutched in Khalil's free hand. "Children who look about Tommy's age. I was told they would be martyrs," Khalil whispered, his voice breaking. "I was told the cause justified any sacrifice." But looking at him, he gestured toward Tommy, who was now trying to fold a candy wrapper into the shape of a soldier. "Children aren't political statements," Marcus replied. "They're just children. Your children, his children, all of them deserve to grow up." The crowd around them continued to press closer to the ceremony, creating a bubble of strange intimacy in the midst of public spectacle. Tommy had succeeded in creating a paper soldier, and was proudly showing it to both men, completely unaware that his innocent presence had prevented a massacre. Khalil's thumb moved away from the detonator trigger. The movement was small, barely visible. But Marcus saw it and felt a surge of relief. The immediate crisis was passing, but they weren't safe yet. A device like this likely had multiple triggering mechanisms, and the terrorist's emotional state remained fragile. "What happens now?" Khalil asked, his voice hollow with the realization of what he had almost done. "Now you make the hardest choice of your life," Marcus replied. "You decide who you really are. Are you someone who kills children, or someone who protects them?" Tommy looked up from his paper soldier creation with sudden concern. "Are you still sad?" he asked Khalil. "My daddy says when people are really sad, they need hugs." "Do you need a hug?" The offer, made with complete sincerity by a child who had no idea he was addressing someone who had planned to kill him, broke something fundamental inside Khalil Hassan. The photograph of his own children slipped from his fingers as he sank to his knees on the cobblestones, sobbing openly. Marcus moved quickly but carefully, positioning himself to shield both the child and the terrorist from curious onlookers while keeping the detonator in sight. They had passed the immediate crisis, but the situation was far from resolved. A bomb was still armed, a crowd of innocents still surrounded them, and they needed to find a way to safely defuse both the device and the emotional trauma that had created it. From the palace gate, Whitfield watched with professional satisfaction as the American handled the delicate aftermath of the crisis. The immediate threat had passed, but both soldiers understood that the most dangerous moment might still be ahead. A remorseful terrorist was safer than an active one. But a bomb remained armed, and one wrong move could still trigger catastrophe. The ceremony continued around them, a testament to the stability of tradition, even in the face of modern threats. But for 3 men and 1 small boy kneeling on ancient cobblestones, the real test of courage was just beginning. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Khalil Hassan, who moments before had been prepared to commit mass murder, now knelt on the cobblestones with tears streaming down his face, while a 6-year-old boy patted his shoulder consolingly. But Marcus knew they were far from safe. The improvised explosive device remained armed, and even a repentant terrorist posed risks, if not handled properly. "Tommy," Marcus said gently, "I think your parents are looking for you. Can you wave to them, so they know you're okay?" The boy looked around and spotted his frantic parents pushing through the crowd. With the adaptability that only children possess, he immediately shifted his attention from the crying stranger to his approaching family. "Mummy, Daddy, I made a soldier." He held up his folded candy wrapper proudly. As Tommy's parents reached them, Marcus smoothly positioned himself between the family and Khalil, using his body to shield them from seeing the detonator device. "Your son's quite the little diplomat," he told them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was trying to cheer up this gentleman who seemed upset about something. Long, Tommy's mother, Sarah Morrison, looked embarrassed but grateful. "I'm so sorry if he bothered you. He has no sense of stranger danger, I'm afraid." "No bother at all," Marcus replied, maintaining his protective position. Sometimes kids see things adults miss. As the Morrison family moved away, reunited and oblivious to how close they had come to tragedy, Marcus turned his full attention back to Khalil. The man was still kneeling, but his sobbing had subsided into quiet, shuddering breaths. The photograph of his family lay on the ground beside him, scattered by the wind. "We need to talk about the device," Marcus said quietly, kneeling beside the terrorist at eye level. His tone was calm but serious. "Can you tell me about the triggering mechanisms?" Khalil wiped his eyes with the back of his free hand, still clutching the detonator. "Dead man's switch," he whispered. "If I let go, or if something happens to me suddenly." "Multiple triggers? Timer backup, remote activation possible." Khalil's engineering background showed in his precise technical description, even through his emotional distress. "I designed it to be foolproof." Marcus nodded grimly. This was exactly what he had feared. The device was sophisticated enough that simply removing it from Khalil wouldn't necessarily prevent detonation. They needed either to disarm it properly or to find a way to safely contain the explosion. From his position at the palace gate, Guardsman Whitfield had been watching the situation develop with growing concern. He could see that the immediate crisis had passed but understood that the danger remained. More importantly, he recognized that his American counterpart was now handling what amounted to a bomb disposal situation in the middle of a crowded tourist area. The ceremony was approaching its conclusion, which meant the crowd would soon begin to disperse. Under normal circumstances, this would be good news. Fewer people in the danger zone. But with an armed explosive device present, the movement of hundreds of people could create chaos that might accidentally trigger the bomb or prevent proper emergency response. Whitfield made a decision that would end his career but potentially save hundreds of lives. Moving with the same precision that characterized all his ceremonial duties, he began signaling to his commanding officer using discreet military hand signs. The message was brief but urgent. Bomb threat. Crowd evacuation needed. American ally controlling situation. Captain Morrison Wells, the officer in charge of the ceremony, was a 20-year veteran who had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. He understood immediately what his guardsman was communicating and faced his own impossible choice. Evacuating the crowd would cause panic and might trigger the very disaster they were trying to prevent. But leaving hundreds of civilians in potential danger was equally unacceptable. Meanwhile, Marcus was working to establish a deeper connection with Khalil. "Tell me about your family," he said, retrieving the scattered photograph from the cobblestones. "What are their names?" "Fatima," Khalil whispered, looking at the picture. "My daughter. She's 7. And Ahmad. My son. He's 5. His voice broke again. "They look like that boy. They would have played with him, if they had met. Where are they now?" "Damascus. With my wife's family." Khalil's grip on the detonator loosened slightly as he focused on the photograph. "I came here to study. But the war. Everything changed. My brother was killed in an airstrike. They said it was Western forces, that all of us were targets." Marcus understood. Grief and rage had been weaponized by extremist recruiters who preyed on vulnerable people in desperate situations. Khalil wasn't a monster. He was a broken man who had been manipulated into believing that violence against innocents was justified revenge. "Your children," Marcus said carefully. "What would they think if they knew what you were planning today?" The question hit its target. Khalil's entire body shuddered as he confronted the reality of explaining to his young children why their father had killed other children. They would never understand. They would be ashamed. Then don't give them a reason to be ashamed. Around them, the ceremony was reaching its final movements. The band played "God Save the King," while the guards executed their concluding drill with mechanical precision. But Captain Morrison Wells had begun implementing a subtle crowd control strategy, using his officers to gradually guide tourists away from the immediate area around Marcus and Khalil. The evacuation had to appear natural, a normal conclusion to the ceremony rather than an emergency response. Too obvious an effort would create the panic they were trying to avoid. Morrison Wells positioned his men to create gentle pressure that encouraged the crowd to move toward the exits, while making it seem like routine crowd management. Whitfield, still at his post but now coordinating with his commanding officer through discreet signals, watched the American continue his psychological approach to the crisis. It was masterful work, treating the terrorist as a human being in crisis, rather than simply an enemy to be defeated. But the guardsman could see that time was running short. Even the most gradual evacuation would eventually leave Marcus and Khalil exposed and alone with the armed device. "I want to see them again," Khalil said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been since the crisis began. "My children. I want to go home." "Then let's make that happen," Marcus replied. "But first, we need to deal with this device safely. Can you walk me through the disarming procedure?" Khalil shook his head. "There isn't one. I designed it to be tamper-proof. The only safe way is—" He gestured helplessly. "I would have to throw it into the fountain, into water. The electrical systems might short out before the timer expires." Marcus looked toward the Victoria Memorial Fountain, easily 200 yards away across open ground. Even if they could reach it in time, throwing an armed explosive device through a public space was hardly a safe solution. But it might be the only option they had. "How much time is left on the timer?" 12 minutes, maybe 13. Not enough time to evacuate the remaining crowd and clear the area properly. Not enough time to bring in bomb disposal experts. But possibly enough time to try Khalil's suggestion. If they moved immediately. "Here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of command that came naturally after years of combat leadership. "We're going to walk together toward that fountain. Slowly, calmly, like two friends having a conversation. When we get close enough, you're going to throw the device into the water while I make sure no one else is in danger. What if it doesn't work? What if the water doesn't short the circuits fast enough? Then we'll face whatever comes next together," Marcus replied simply. "But your children will know that in the end, their father chose to try to save lives, rather than take them." Khalil nodded, still clutching both the detonator and his family's photograph. "The American soldier and the failed terrorist," he said with bitter irony. "And strange partnership." "Not a terrorist," Marcus corrected firmly. A father who got lost but found his way back in time. They stood together. Two men from different worlds united by the weight of the moment. Around them, the crowd continued its gradual dispersal, while the ceremony concluded with traditional pageantry. From his post at the palace gate, Guardsman Whitfield watched them begin their careful journey toward the fountain, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether this day would be remembered for its celebration of tradition or its tragedy. The walk to the fountain would be the longest 200 yards of both men's lives. Every step carried the weight of hundreds of innocent lives. Every moment brought them closer to either salvation or disaster. And somewhere in Damascus, two children played in their grandmother's garden, unaware that their father was about to make the choice that would define the rest of his life. The walk toward the Victoria Memorial Fountain felt like a journey through eternity. Marcus and Khalil moved with deliberate calm across the palace grounds, two men carrying the weight of hundreds of lives between them. Around them, the post-ceremony crowd continued its gradual dispersal, guided by Captain Morrison Wells' officers in what appeared to be routine crowd management, but was actually a carefully orchestrated evacuation. With each step, Marcus calculated distances, timing, and angles. The fountain was still 180 yards away, and they had perhaps 11 minutes left on the timer. The device in Khalil's hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, not from its physical weight but from the psychological burden it represented. "Tell me more about your studies," Marcus said as they walked, keeping his voice conversational. Psychological stability was crucial now. Any sudden emotional shift could trigger disaster. "Engineering," Khalil replied, his voice still shaky but growing stronger. "Specifically, bridge construction. I came to London to learn about Victorian engineering techniques." Ironic, isn't it? "I wanted to build things, to create something lasting." "You still can," Marcus assured him. "This doesn't have to define you. Your children don't have to grow up knowing their father as anything other than a man who made a mistake, but found the courage to correct it." From his position at the palace gate, Guardsman Whitfield watched their progress with professional admiration mixed with personal concern. The American was handling the situation with remarkable skill, but Whitfield could see the strain in both men's postures. The next few minutes would test every aspect of their training and character. Behind them, little Tommy Morrison was telling his parents about the sad man and the soldier friend who had helped cheer him up. His innocent account would later become crucial evidence in understanding how the crisis had been resolved through human compassion rather than military force. But for now, his family simply saw it as another example of their son's irrepressible friendliness toward strangers. As Marcus and Khalil reached the halfway point to the fountain, they encountered their first major obstacle. A group of tourists had gathered around the memorial, taking photographs and consulting guidebooks. The area that needed to be clear for their desperate plan was occupied by innocent people who had no idea they were standing in a potential blast zone. "What do we do?" Khalil whispered, his grip tightening unconsciously on the detonator. The increased pressure nearly triggered the device, but Marcus quickly placed a steadying hand on the terrorist's wrist. "Easy," Marcus said softly. "We adapt. Every mission has unexpected complications." Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. They couldn't simply wait for the tourists to leave naturally. There wasn't enough time. But approaching the group and asking them to move would likely attract attention and questions they couldn't answer. They needed a distraction, something that would draw people away from the fountain area without causing panic. That's when salvation appeared in an unexpected form. A street performer, one of the many entertainers who worked the tourist areas around London's landmarks, had set up his act near the fountain. The man was dressed as a living statue, painted in silver, and moving only when people placed coins in his hat. His presence had already begun to draw a crowd of curious onlookers. "Can you keep walking for another minute?" Marcus asked Khalil quietly. "I think so. The timer shows 9 minutes, 40 seconds. They continued their approach, and Marcus began formulating a plan. The street performer was actually providing the perfect cover. His act naturally drew people into a circle around him, creating the kind of cleared space they needed around the fountain. But they would have to time their approach perfectly to take advantage of it. As they drew closer, Marcus could see that the performer was genuinely talented. His statue routine was elaborate and entertaining, complete with period costume and remarkably realistic movements when he chose to animate. The crowd around him was growing, drawing people away from the immediate vicinity of the fountain itself. "When we get close," Marcus instructed quietly, "I'm going to create a distraction. When the area is clear, you throw the device into the deepest part of the fountain, and then we both run." "Understood?" Khalil nodded, his engineer's mind already calculating trajectory and timing. "The water level looks to be about 3 feet deep at the center. If the circuits short out within 30 seconds of immersion, then we all go home to our families," Marcus finished. They were now within 50 yards of the fountain. The street performers' crowd provided excellent cover, but Marcus could see several police officers on the perimeter who would respond quickly to any sign of trouble. The next few minutes would require precise timing and a considerable amount of luck. From the palace, Guardsman Whitfield had lost visual contact with the American and the terrorist as they moved behind the memorial structure. But he could see the police officers taking subtle positions around the fountain area. Captain Morrison Wells was clearly coordinating with local authorities, preparing for whatever was about to happen, while maintaining the appearance of normal security operations. Marcus checked his watch. 8 minutes. 15 seconds remaining. They were as close as they could safely get without triggering unwanted attention. The moment of truth had arrived. "Are you ready?" he asked Khalil. The Syrian engineer looked at the photograph of his children one more time, then carefully placed it in his jacket pocket. "I'm ready to go home to them," he said with quiet determination. Marcus stepped away from Khalil and approached the street performers' crowd with purpose. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough to be heard clearly, "but I think that statue just moved when no one was looking." "I'm C." The crowd immediately turned their attention to watching the performer more closely, eager to catch him in the act of unauthorized movement. Several people laughed and pointed, and the performer himself seemed delighted by the increased scrutiny, incorporating Marcus's accusation into his routine by making increasingly subtle movements designed to be just barely noticeable. The distraction worked perfectly. The crowd pressed closer to the performer, completely focused on his act, and turning their backs to the fountain area. In that moment, the space around the memorial's reflecting pool was as clear as it was likely to get. Khalil stepped forward, raised the detonator above his head, and hurled it with all his strength toward the center of the fountain. The device arced through the air in a graceful parabola, spinning slightly as it flew. Time seemed suspended as everyone's fate hung in the balance of that single throw. The modified cell phone hit the water with a splash that seemed impossibly loud in the moment of silence that followed. Then came the sound that Marcus had been dreading, a sharp electronic beep that indicated the device was still active despite its immersion. "Run!" Marcus shouted, abandoning all pretense of secrecy. He grabbed Khalil's arm, and they both sprinted away from the fountain as fast as their legs could carry them. Behind them, the street performers' crowd scattered in confusion as police officers appeared from multiple directions, shouting orders and clearing the area. The electronic beeping continued for what felt like hours but was actually only 37 seconds. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was broken only by the normal sounds of the fountain's water circulation and the distant traffic of London. Khalil fell to his knees 20 yards from the fountain, overwhelmed by relief and emotional exhaustion. The device had been neutralized. The water had indeed shorted out the electrical systems before the timer could trigger detonation. Hundreds of innocent lives had been saved by an engineering solution proposed by the same man who had originally threatened them. Marcus stood beside him, breathing heavily from their desperate sprint but feeling the weight of responsibility finally lifting from his shoulders. Around them, police officers were establishing a perimeter and beginning to secure the scene. In the distance, he could see bomb disposal experts arriving to examine the neutralized device. From the palace gate, Guardsman Whitfield allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction before resuming his ceremonial duties. The crisis had been resolved through courage, compassion, and the kind of split-second decision-making that defined truly elite soldiers. The American had handled the situation with exactly the skill and humanity that the British soldier would have expected from a fellow professional. Captain Morrison Wells approached Marcus and Khalil with a combination of relief and professional curiosity. "Gentlemen," he said, in the crisp accent of a career military officer, "I believe we have quite a bit to discuss. Over the next several hours, the full scope of what had occurred became clear. Khalil Hassan had been radicalized through online propaganda following his brother's death in Syria. He had planned to detonate an improvised explosive device during the changing of the guard ceremony as revenge against what he perceived as Western aggression in the Middle East. But the intervention of little Tommy Morrison, combined with the patient psychological work of Marine Sergeant Marcus Chen, had broken through the artificial hatred that had been constructed around Khalil's genuine grief. Faced with the reality of the innocent people he was planning to kill, the would-be terrorist had found the strength to choose a different path. The investigation revealed that Khalil had been operating alone, recruited through online channels but without direct contact with any organized terrorist group. His engineering background had made him particularly valuable to the recruiters, who had provided him with bomb-making instructions and ideological justification for his planned attack. In the weeks that followed, Khalil would cooperate fully with authorities, providing information that led to the disruption of several online radicalization networks. He would serve time in prison for his planning and preparation of the attack, but his cooperation, and the unique circumstances of his change of heart, would result in a sentence that offered the possibility of eventual reunification with his family. Marcus returned to his leave in London, with a new understanding of how heroism sometimes looked different than he had imagined. He had expected that if he ever had to save lives in a crisis, it would involve weapons and tactical action. Instead, it had required patience, empathy, and faith in the fundamental decency of human nature. Guardsman Whitfield completed his ceremonial duty that day and returned to barracks with a story that he would share only with his closest military colleagues. The silent communication between him and the American Marine had been a perfect example of professional soldiers recognizing each other across national boundaries and working together despite impossible constraints. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from Damascus. It was written in careful English by Khalil's wife, thanking him for helping her husband find his way back to the man she had married, rather than the broken stranger he had become. Enclosed was a photograph of Fatima and Ahmad playing in their grandmother's garden, smiling children who would grow up knowing their father as a man who had made a terrible mistake, but found the courage to correct it before it was too late. The letter also included a small gift. A paper soldier folded from candy wrapper, made by Tommy Morrison during a subsequent visit to the palace, and given to Khalil's family through the complex international networks that connected their story. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force against hatred is the innocent trust of a child who sees only the good in people. The official reports would describe the incident as a successful counterterrorism operation, resulting in the prevention of a major attack through the cooperation of American and British forces. But those who were there understood that the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about the moment when human decency triumphed over programmed hatred, when a father's love for his children overcame his desire for revenge, and when two soldiers from different countries discovered that their most important victory came not from defeating an enemy, but from saving one.